A very good evening and welcome to the Watchdog. I'm Peter Ndoro, standing in for Vuyon Voko tonight. Now, the FPB, the Film and Publications Board, and the Department of Communications have welcomed the Films and Publications Amendment Act, which came into effect on the 1st of March this year. Now, the Amendment Act extends the mandate and functions of the FPB to regulate online content, in addition to physical content. And tonight we'll be taking a look at this Amendment Act in detail. The Watchdog begins right now. Online content distributors will now face criminal charges for non-compliance following the promulgation of the Film and Publications Board Amendment Act. Now, this act seeks to modernize laws that protect the citizenry, including children, from exposure to prohibited content distributed online. It was signed into law by President Cyril Ramaphosa in 2019.
A tougher cyberspace law. The Amendment Act will now give the board power to regulate almost all online content published in South Africa. This entails all online distributors will be required to register with and submit all content to the board for classification. No person may expose through any medium, including the internet and social media, a private sexual photograph known as revenge photography. And any person who knowingly distributes hate speech in any medium which amounts to propaganda for war, incites violence or advocates hate speech shall be guilty of an offense.
The only content that is not allowed relates to those aspects that we as South Africans find offensive or unconstitutional, such as the hate speech, incitement to war, child sexual abuse material, bestiality, etc. This puts the power in the hands of the consumer to make informed choices of what they want to view or read, and to likewise make these choices to protect their children from exposure to content that can cause developmental and psychological harm.
The amendment comes at a time when the world's governments are grappling with the increasing cases of potentially harmful content on digital platforms.
We don't need to look far to see that there have been numerous cases where mental anguish has been caused because of online bullying, trolling, severe character assassination, harassment, and all of these leading to real-life implications such as even suicide in certain instances, which is not desirable for our country.
On the media front, the Act provides for coverage of online videos only for Press Council members.
So we have considered that and accommodated for it in our amendment regulations to ensure that we do, on the premise of why that exclusionary category exists, ensure that we don't stretch our mandate beyond into the space of the media where it should not be, and allow the Press Council to regulate that space appropriately as is prescribed in the legislation. The issue relating to what happens to those members of the Press Council, or those media stakeholders who are not members of the Press Council, the provisions are the provisions.
Members of the public can now lodge complaints when social media content contains prohibited content. Mulimo Wanemoto, SABC News, Pretoria.
Well, joining us now to talk a little bit more about this, we're now joined by Zama Mkhosi, who is the Film and Publications Board's Council Chairperson. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and good to talk to you again, Zama. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a while indeed, Peter, and I am very honoured, as always, to engage with you.
All right, and also want to say good evening to William Bird, who's Director at the Media Monitoring Africa. Thank you so much indeed, William, for joining us.
I'm optimal. Good evening, Peter. Good to be with you.
Great. All right, Zama, let's start with you, because I think some people may not know what you do as a board. I know you sit on the council that oversees the day-to-day work, but When I was growing up, a censorship board, essentially, they got to sit and watch movies all day, put an age restriction, and cut out all the good bits. What do you do in the modern day?
Oh, Peter, revealing your age there. The FPB, the Film and Publications Board, has certainly come a long way from being known to be that censorship body. I think we have advanced certainly to make sure that we are a body that is there to protect the citizens of this country, to make sure that in terms of the content that is consumed by the citizens of this country, there is a balancing act, which is never easy, but is a necessary one, balancing the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. And these are the rights, obviously, to freedom of expression, which we hold quite dearly as the FPB, but also to protect the rights of the citizens, particularly children, from exposure to content that is potentially harmful. And with the extensions that we are going to talk about today that have come with the Amendment Act. But primarily, our role has moved far from censorship to rather classification, and which at the crux of it is to make sure that we educate the public about the content that they are consuming, and to make sure that they are informed so that they can make their own choices about whether to watch something, because we have given them the information as to what the rating of their content is. We're no longer in the business of censorship and removing content from distribution, unless, of course, it falls into the categories that we are going to chat about, I'm sure.
All right. This Amendment Act has been dubbed the Internet Censorship Act, and I guess that speaks to the world that we live in and what you've had to catch up with.
Yeah, and we are really playing a catch-up game, Peter, because trying to catch up with technology as a public entity, as an entity that is a creature of statute, and as you know, developing policy and legislation and regulations is a long process that takes time. And technology nowadays is changing quite swiftly. And the change that technology is bringing is not just on the instrument itself, but the change in technology has brought about change of behavior, change of patterns in terms of content creation, content distribution, content consumption. All of those changes have, we are really trying to play catch up with them, because on the one hand, they are positive in terms of allowing us as citizens to express ourselves a lot more easier, but at the same time, we cannot be in denial of the risks that it has created and the extension of the digital platforms that are likely to cause in certain instances a fatal harm to our citizens.
And it's a huge area to deal with, given that its global nature, but we'll unpack all of that now. William, I suppose it's been a long time coming and a necessary thing to do to amend, to bring an amendment. But not everybody's thrilled about it. There have been some concerns about this amendment. What have you been observing as potential issues?
So we've been working on the bill since that first amendment, and I think the first amendment version that came out was politely called an internet censorship bill. It was completely and utterly mad. It was the kind of thing that a lunatic would have dreamt up and then added into a lunatic's breakfast for tea, because it proposed to allow the FPB to effectively regulate all online content and pre-classify all online content. Thankfully, the Film Publications Board engaged successfully with a whole range of stakeholders, and the version that has been passed today, while there's still some challenges, it's a significantly better piece of legislation than it was, which isn't to say it's perfect, But as Zama has pointed out, this is a consistently moving target. So getting things right all the time is actually fairly difficult. But in terms of some of the things that it does seek to address, clearly we needed to address some of the issues relating to online harm, relating to children, as an example. We needed to make sure that there was space to deal with non-consensual sharing of adult material, and certainly also dealing with child sexual abuse material in a more comprehensive way. I think the Film and Publications Act was already pretty damn strict on non-child sexual abuse material, otherwise called child pornography, but more appropriately CSAM. And this really takes that a few steps further. So I think that there are some very good provisions in it. Overall, though, I think that what we're seeing is that this bill or this act now comes in. We still need to see some regulations to meet some of the gaps that were referred to by one of the guests in the earlier insert, in order to make this something that people are going to be a little bit more comfortable with. Because as it stands, I think if it would certainly be subjected to legal challenge.
Talking about legal challenge, there's some people who feel that some of the language is quite vague. I suppose this is a new area, and maybe case law over time will help it to become more specific.
Well, look, some of the issues will have to be sorted out in the regulations. So we are making a submission. I think the closing date is tomorrow. Actually, we're making a submission around some of the definitions that they've used in the regulations that'll help tighten things up and make sure that these things work together in a more coherent manner. But one of the big battles that we had was around the term distributor, and you think, well, why can that be such a controversial issue? And it was controversial because the way it was defined was that essentially almost anyone could be a distributor. So you sending a message to your family, you could have been a distributor, and then you would have been forced to subject yourself to pre-classification, pre-publication classification every time you sent a message, which clearly wasn't the intent of the responsible people in the FPB, but certainly, some of them, I think, when they first saw this target, they thought, oh joy, oh rapture, here we're going to be able to go and take on the world and set everything to rights.
Zama, who does this law affect in terms of distributor? I mean, we've got Netflix that are based in the United States. Would they have to comply with South African law?
Yes, this law applies to the definition of distributor is divided into two. We've got commercial distributors and non-commercial distributors. Commercial distributors is anyone that wishes to make available content in South Africa for sale. So that then obviously includes, as you're saying, the type of entities that you have mentioned. And non-commercial distributors, I think, are the examples that have been made in terms of you and me sharing, our weekend birthday party celebrations on Instagram. It's not for commercial use, and so we are definitely not. We are non-commercial distributors, and the FPB does not have a mandate over non-commercial distributors in terms of requiring them to classify. However, we only extend our jurisdiction to non-commercial distributors as well as commercial distributors to an extent that there is a publication of prohibited content, which is those hate speech and propaganda and such.
But how do you police someone who's in London and just puts up something on the internet? How do you police them?
Well, I think as it was said, that it is not a perfect piece of legislation. It is legislation that has come a long way and has taken into account technological challenges. But also, I think another thing that is introduced by this amendment is different mechanisms of regulation. I think it is recognizing that the way of regulating of the past, when we used to have videotapes, where people used to have to drop the videotapes somewhere in a brown envelope, as you're saying, get viewed, and then come back after a couple of days. Those days are gone. Technology has advanced. So it also means that we also have to come up with new mechanisms of regulating in terms of technology, which is work in progress in certain extent. But how we have addressed the issue at this stage, the Amendment Act introduces a concept called co-regulation, for example, because it's not only a question of location, but it's also a question of volume. Because if you consider the volume that some of the online distributors publish at a time, it is simply not practical for an entity like FPB or any other external entity for that matter to be able to view all of them and pre-classify. Hence, the Amendment Act recognizes this limitation and introduces a concept of co-regulation, which means that the Netflixes of this world do not need to submit their content to us individually. However, we provide them with classification guidelines, and they use those classification guidelines in order to classify their own content. Obviously, there are checks and balances that we have put in place to make sure that we regularly audit how they classify their content to ensure compliance. But this is just but one example of what we have done in order to address those real challenges in terms of technology and volume and location, as you said.
All right. William, Zama at the beginning explained how the FPB has evolved over time. Some people feel that it's evolved too much now, becoming a regulator rather than perhaps its classification roles and things like that. What are your thoughts on this? Because there could be potentially overlaps with other bodies.
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting question because, of course, this is all very much in the air given the draft white paper on audio-visual content. That is, I think, in the second version, will be released in its second iteration, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. So, and that envisages quite a different kind of mechanism. So we know that government is currently looking at the best way of dealing with these things. There have been suggestions that the FPB would then become some kind of a content regulator as opposed to a classifications body. Where, you know, they've got that lovely phrase, we inform so you can choose, or we inform so you can decide, which I think is what you want it for. You know, you want, as a parent, as an ordinary consumer, to know that content that you're looking at, this has been looked at someone before, and they tell you that these and these and these things, the language is too strong, or there's this much nudity, or there are these kinds of issues in it, and you can then decide on whether or not you want to watch that. And that's a very helpful process and service, and that's something that's replicated around the world, and our Film and Publications Board shares the same standards as they do in, you know, all the various other developed and so-called developed nations. So that's a very good thing. Where I think you do then run into a problem is when you start to introduce this idea of regulating content. And of course that's where there was initially some significant overlap with the first iteration of this bill. Now in its current format, I think there's still some potentially worrying elements. But I think that the ground is shifting so fast that we're going to be seeing some other kind of entity coming in potentially alongside, replacing, we're not sure yet. They're talking about a super regulator, so you know that really isn't clear. But what is clear is that you do need something that's an entity, a public independent body that's able to say and make determinations on a whole variety of these things. And some of the things that are in this bill, or in this act, sorry, I keep forgetting, are really critical. You know, we do need to empower people. The FPB fulfills an incredible service in dealing with child sexual abuse material. they're able to work with the police and help combat those kinds of crimes. And that's something that I think everyone is in agreement. Yes, we need to make sure that that goes well beyond just mere classification. That's about active engagement in criminal prosecution. And that's something that we do want to encourage. At the same time, you then don't want to say, well, okay, go ahead and investigate Russia television. Like, we'd all be going, whoa, that's a bridge too far. And so I think that where it is now, there's potentially some overlap and overreach in some of the areas in this particular act. But in broad terms, I think that most of the provisions should be welcomed.
All right, so I'm going to get your thoughts on this just now, but let's stay with this, because you've mentioned Russia today. What about news? And this is what you and I often talk about most of the times. You've got the press council. I think it came up in the package just before we started. Where does it stop and start then?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So at the moment there is an exceptions clause in the Act. I forget where it is now, what section it is of the Act. But essentially, members of the Press Council are exempt from pre-classification publication. In other words, they can continue to produce the news as they would. What that means, though, for publications that aren't members of the Press Council, well, that starts to be a bit of an interesting dilemma. So, as an example, it means that entities like Independent, which are not members of the Press Council, by all intents and purposes, as per the law as it stands now, they would need to submit their content for pre-publication classification before they can produce it. Otherwise, they will be in breach of the law. And that raises all sorts of issues, So you want to encourage people to be members of the Press Council, but is it a bridge too far to say that if you aren't a member, that then you're going to be, you're going to be subjected to these processes? And many people may well say, well, if you're not prepared to subject yourself to those standards, then you need to be subjected to some standards. And if it's the FPB, well, then so be it.
Yeah. Zama, your thoughts? Because some people think that you've got too much power now.
Well, I think to use language, the challenges are quite extensive. I think the challenges and the potential implications and the risks that are posed by online content and harmful online content, I think are massive. And I don't think that we need to see more of such damage that is being caused, emotional, personal, family, financial. In certain instances, even the losses become at a large scale when there are certain public disturbances that are promoted using the internet. So I think the risks are quite significant, that you do need a public body that is empowered to regulate the space. However, that body will always need to be given the powers within the ambit of the Constitution. And there needs to be checks and balances that are put in place to make sure that it is not it's not just what Zama Mkhosi believes in for her child personally, but really we can put in there and ensure that there is a balance. There is, for instance, this Amendment Act introduces a quasi-judicial body that is called the Enforcement Committee, and this Enforcement Committee is going to be headed by an individual. It's going to be an individual team of experts that are going to look at appeals coming in from any outcomes from the FPB with regards to this Amendment Act. And that body is going to be chaired by a retired judge. And the qualifications of the members of that body needs to be such that we can rely on their skills and expertise as well as objectivity. So certainly checks and balances need to be put in place, but I think we can no longer deny the fact that we do need to find a way of regulating. It may take some time to find the right balance, but I think we are on the right track.
All right. Definitions are going to be quite a thing. A commercial distributor. Now, I know there are some people who've got YouTube channels that have got more viewers than some news channels, and they get money. So they are actually commercial entities, and by content creation and putting it up, they're distributing content. How do you police this maze, and where does it stop and start from an individual just doing his own thing to someone who really could be, in real terms, be likened to a commercial distributor?
You got it spot on there, Peter. I'm actually very impressed with your understanding of the legislation as it is, because you've interpreted it accurately, and exactly because of the challenge, we at the FPB realize that we have to be strategic, and we have to be open in terms of how do we then engage with the role players in order to come up with a mechanism that is practical for the type of platform that is at place. For instance, you're referring to YouTube. I am aware that there are certain arrangements with channels like those in terms of how we regulate through the platform rather than through the individual. You remember I mentioned earlier the concept of co-regulating with platforms. So what arrangement can we enter into with the platform that, for instance, if a platform comes to us and gives us an assurance and workshops with us as to how they are going to put checks and balances on their platform to make sure that they still protect the South African public from harmful content. And if we as the FPB are satisfied that those mechanisms that they have put in place are in fact aligned with the spirit and the principle of the Amendment Act, that is where we can enter into certain exemptions with that platform, because we have reached an understanding that the ultimate goal of protecting the citizens of South Africa will be achieved, and it does not necessarily need to be done through the individuals of the FPB, for as long as the platform can share that responsibility with us.
All right. William, this is a great idea, and we have to have something, but I'm fearful that actually we might be overwhelmed given the things that are out there, technology that's out there, that just says, actually, we're not going to participate, we're not going to cooperate, and we're going to bypass you using things like VPN or whatever. How do we manage this mountain? I mean, we can't give up, for sure, but you can see the challenge and the size of it in front of us.
So, I mean, I think that's why it's really important that we clearly and carefully delimit the mandate of the FPB, as opposed to something that may be different, like a super regulator, right? Where the FPB is now, it should be there to classify, to help inform people so that they know what they're watching has gone through some kind of a similar or equivalent process. So if you're watching it, I can watch this with my child, or I can watch this with my teen, or I can watch it on my own if it's of a certain age restricted level. Right? That's what you want to be able to do. The moment you start to then bring in those grey areas around, well, what if they start using language that we don't like, and what if they fall outside of that scope? You then start to run into very real challenges that the FPB is going to have to try and navigate beyond that basic classification process, right? Because your example of the YouTuber who's got millions of viewers, you've got viewers that YouTubers that do these game channels, and they've got millions and millions of viewers. Are you going to say to them, well, okay, you need to subject yourself to this process, or we're going to say to YouTube, right, you need to put an age classification on that is appropriate for this, so that we know that it's gone through some kind of a process. YouTube to varying degrees is going to say, well, obviously we want to make sure that we don't fall foul of legislation, and that we adhere to the law, and that we don't harm children, and because of that we're going to do these things. So their limits will be a lot different to the ones that we have in South Africa, and that's why it starts to get complicated, because when you can talk about something like child sexual abuse material, there's broad agreement on that. Whether it's YouTube, TikTok, whoever it is, you say, this kind of content we're not going to allow. Everyone will say, yes, we agree, and we can all work together happily to do whatever we can to limit and stamp that kind of content out. The moment you diverge from that and you start saying it's going to go into these and these and these areas, you then start getting people going, well, no, according to our platform, they can do this, but they can't do that. If you use these kinds of words, well, it's okay, but maybe in context, blah, 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 and you start to get all sorts of other challenges that emerge with that. And then, you've got the international realm. So I think part of the answer is making sure that we define and clearly delimit that. The other thing that we haven't spoken about, and I'm aware we're running out of time, is the critical issue of making sure that we inform and educate the public. So we partner with the Film Publications Board as one of those partners to give children especially and adults the ability to self-regulate, because that's part of what's essential to this. If you can get them to choose carefully and responsibly to begin with, you're going to avoid a lot of the problems anyway.
All right. We have run out of time, but Zama, 30 seconds, final thought for our viewers, why this Amendment Act is important.
It is important because we need to make sure that we act responsibly. We need to make sure that as easy as it is to now communicate through online and the internet, it does not take away our responsibility, and we have to be responsible in the way that we're doing it. And FPB is here to make sure that it informs the public as to how to go about doing that. And key stakeholders like those online platforms, we are going to work with them in order to find ways of coming up with mechanisms that we can implement in a way that works for both of us.
All right. Well, to the both of you, thank you so much indeed for joining us. Zama Nkosi and William Bird, always a pleasure talking to you. I wish you the best with this project. I really do. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, Peter. Keep well.
All right. Okay, that was Zama Nkosi and William Bird. Zama Nkosi is the Film and Publications Board Council Chairperson, and William Bird, often on our programme, commentator on media issues, is the Director, Media Monitoring Africa. Now, in other related news, the Department of Communications says that the complete switch-off of analogue transmissions in the country is fast approaching. And the end of March will mark the end of the analogue broadcast era in South Africa, ushering in a new era of digital broadcasting. The country missed the deadline of 17 June 2015 for digital migration, which committed to the International Telecommunications Union over a decade ago.
The 31 of March will be the deadline, a process that started back in 2006, where international countries, including South Africa, agreed to digital migration. This process involves the distribution of set-top boxes, a device that enables users to receive digital television services. These devices are currently being distributed to poor households for better television picture quality and a multitude of channels. Households with a combined income of less than 3,500 Rand a month qualify for a free installation.
The completion of this process is critical, as the digital dividend spectrum emanating from this switch-off will be used for the deployment of the much-needed radio frequency spectrum, or what we call the international mobile telecommunications spectrum, mainly to support the uptake of mobile broadband communications in the country.
The country's broadcasting signal distributor, Centec, urges households with analog television sets and who cannot afford the new set-top boxes to register at their nearest post office for assistance.
If you are receiving a scrolling message on your TV sets from time to time about analog switch off, you are still receiving your television services on analog mode and need to get a digital set-top box to receive digital services.
Deloitte's Africa partner Mohammed Sheikh says this migration will benefit South Africans to watch their favorite shows in a higher quality format.
If you watch TV using a DSTV or an eMedia OpenView decoder, you should not be affected. The migration for me is positive as digital adoption accelerates in our country, since the spectrum can be used by telecommunication providers to satisfy the increasing demand for connectivity using services, for example, like 5G. There is also a benefit for consumers to watch their favorite TV shows in much higher quality, which would result then in a better viewing experience.
South Africa should have moved to digital broadcasting for both TV and radio from analog 5 years ago. But government has failed to meet that deadline until now. Nothando Makutulela, SABC News, Johannesburg.
So there you have it. We're going digital. Very, very exciting. And it's all going to kick off literally in a few weeks' time. So that's a new visual experience that you'll be having in the next few weeks. Now, we take a quick break. But coming after the break, the United Nations had a special assembly, an emergency session to vote on what Russia should do in Ukraine. And there was a huge vote. And 17 countries abstained in Africa, and another 17 to 20, another 7 or 5 didn't even vote at all. And we're going to find out what that means. South Africa was one of those countries that abstained. All of that still to come. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're still watching the Watchdog. Now, a number of African countries voted in favour of the UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's military action in Ukraine and demanding its unconditional troop withdrawal. They included heavyweights like Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana and Egypt. South Africa was among a group of 17 African countries that abstained, but there were a further 5 countries that didn't vote at all. And some of these countries that abstained included Mali, Zimbabwe and Eritrea. And they voted against the adoption of the text, but an overwhelming majority of 141 countries ensured the draft's passage, a move immediately welcomed by the United Nations Secretary General, who said that it was his duty to stand by the text and be guided by its call.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favour, 141, against 5, abstentions 35. Draft resolution is adopted.
Russia's position increasingly isolated among the 193 member states, with just 4 countries, Belarus, Syria, the DPRK and Eritrea, siding with Moscow. Despite this effort from its envoy.
We call on you not to support this draft. However, we know about the unprecedented pressure that our Western partners are exerting on a large number of countries, urging them to vote as they see fit. This document will not allow us to end military activities. On the contrary, it could embolden Kiev radicals and nationalists to continue to determine the policy of their country at any price.
Western countries hailed the vote as sending a clear message.
The world has spoken with a clear, united voice. Together, the vast majority of the world has condemned Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable war. We have deplored Belarus for allowing its territory to be used to facilitate this aggression. We have affirmed Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The Secretary General, finding himself at odds with Moscow over his fierce defense of the UN Charter, spoke after the vote.
The message of the General Assembly is loud and clear. End hostilities in Ukraine now. Silence the guns now. Open the door to dialogue and diplomacy now. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine must be respected in line with the UN Charter. We don't have a moment to lose.
Mr. President, let me reiterate our position.
South Africa's abstention expected after its swift backtrack from an earlier position calling for Russia's immediate withdrawal from Ukraine, asserting the view that the draft was unbalanced.
The resolution that we have considered today does not create an environment conducive for diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation. While we agree with and support the efforts taken by member states to bring to the attention of the international community the situation in Ukraine, South Africa feels that greater attention should have been paid to bringing the sides closer to dialogue.
But a majority of African countries voted in favour.
Rwanda voted in favour of this resolution to firmly support that sovereignty, independence, and interior integrity of any country must be respected. We supported this resolution to reaffirm our commitment to the Charter of the United Nations.
Human rights organisations have issued stinging rebukes of Pretoria's position. Human Rights Watch's UN Director Lou Charbonneau told SABC News that the abstention was an insult to Nelson Mandela's legacy. Quote, when a country like Russia disregards human rights and international humanitarian law by bombing civilians in Ukraine, South Africa should be condemning it loudly and clearly. This was echoed by the Executive Director of the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect, Savita Pondi, who said that while she respects South Africa's position on creating an environment for dialogue and mediation, this was a time to stand unequivocally with the UN Charter and Ukraine. Sherman Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
Well, joining us now is Dr. Charles Sinkala, who's an Africa Political Affairs Analyst. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, Dr. Sinkala. 17 African countries abstained. 8 didn't even bother to vote on this resolution, and that's a huge number. The international community, by and large, saw this as a simple equation. You just can't invade another person's country. What has South Africa missed and the other 8 countries that didn't even bother to vote? Is there something that we're not seeing as a global community, or is there something that these 17 plus 8 countries are seeing that should be paid attention to?
Yes, Peter, thank you very much for having me, and good evening to your viewers. It is quite difficult, Peter, for countries such as South Africa to ascertain who is the aggressor and who is the victim in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Hence, they have taken up a neutral step, in terms of addressing this international conflict. You must remember that South Africa is part of the BRICS countries, which includes Russia as its partner. Even saying that, siding either of one of the parties, such as Russia or Ukraine, will bring a disparity and diplomatic spat between South Africa and Ukraine or Russia. For those who have abstained, it is quite not unusual because it is quite very difficult, as what the Permanent Secretary has said, a representative of United Nations from South Africa, that United Nations, especially United Nations Security Council and the Office of the United Nations Secretary General, should be a platform that should bring the two parties to book and find out exactly what has been happening in an effort to bring dialogue and diplomatic loosening up of tensions, rather than escalating the military presence in Ukraine and the conflicts beyond that. I mean, what the Permanent Secretary or Permanent Representative to the United Nations has explained, that they should be building bridges rather than breaking bridges in terms of mediating the conflicts between the two countries. And the text in itself, which was presented to the United Nations General Council, it was something to victimize Russia in all totality. They should have addressed the two parties.
Dr. Sinkana, I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to jump in a little bit. You mentioned BRICS, which is interesting because Brazil actually voted for this resolution. So they're saying, yeah, you are a partner, but what you're doing is wrong. You cannot invade another country. So that then must mean, even though India and China have abstained, that the BRICS story perhaps is not compelling enough.
No, look, it is. It just depends, Peter, on how strong is their international policy as a country. Brazil, yes, it has its own reason to, not to follow that route, and that's why they voted. We cannot answer on their behalf, but I do understand as well that South Africa's position also makes a lot of sense, and I think it is also, in my view, that the United Nations should have taken a neutral position, because even the United Nations themselves are guilty of allowing the escalation of military presence in Ukraine by allowing United States of America spending almost $1 billion in the past 6 months to supply arms and ammunition and any military aid to Ukraine. European Union as well, they are of equal guilt for allowing such escalation and sending military presence in Ukraine, as well as NATO. They are also of equal guilty for supplying military equipment and aid to Ukraine. These has been used in the loss of lives in Ukraine.
Dr. Sinkala, so what you're saying is that Russia felt and could be justified in invading another country, Ukraine, as a part of defending its own territory, even though there didn't seem to be an immediate a threat of an attack on their territory. Because one would think you go to war in self-defense, right?
Yes, Peter, in international law, there is always an aggression and as well as a provocation. Nothing happens by accident. Everything happens by appointment. We can remember, leading to the escalation of conflicts and the advancement of the military from Russia, that President Putin sent a very strong message that, the NATO and the EU soldiers who are, advancing towards the eastern part of Ukraine, which will be the jurisdiction or the vicinity of the military presence of Russia, they shall attack should they cross that line. And indeed, they crossed that line, and that constitutes to provocation. And hence, Russia has, reacted in the way they reacted.
So war is justified.
For any loss of lives,
So war is justified. Civilians are being killed.
There's no justification for killing civilians. This should have been avoided. Especially that who drew the first blood. If you look at the whole, follow the whole scenario, you find out that United Nations and United States, European Union and NATO, they drew the first blood by sending the military personnel to Ukraine, and Russia came second. To defend and react as a result of that escalation of military. Yes, we cannot justify killing of innocents and civilians in Ukraine, and as well as Russians as well has been killed, and many other nationalities which are not even documented at this stage.
All right, let me ask you this then. Ukraine is a sovereign state. People voted for their president, and if they decide they want to look west, join the European Union, and join NATO, why should they not be allowed?
Look, in terms of international law, any neighboring country, must decide or rather discuss any matters of security or their interest in the best interest of themselves and the neighboring country. That is clearly stated in the United Nations Chapter 65 of the Security Council. But if they act in a way that you intimidate the neighbor, it does not constitute or to any sovereignty of any country. In fact, where human rights are concerned, there's no such thing as a sovereignty, country, and protection. United Nations or any other country where there's crimes of aggression, where there's crimes of humanity, where there's crimes of war, and where there's any adverse effects in terms of putting the lives in danger, whether in your country or outside the country. Any country who is a signatory to the United Nations human rights, they've got a say which they can intervene in that country, not necessarily physically in terms of military, but they should address it in the proper channels that has been addressed by the United Nations Security Council.
All right, perhaps the final question then, is there a point of having a United Nations if whatever is decided doesn't really have enforcement? It sounds as if this is more a symbolic gesture rather than anything that can happen.
Look, at this stage, where I'm standing, I don't see any point of United Nations participating in terms of mediation, in terms of the conflicts in the world. We can see as well that the abstention from voting towards the text that they presented at the emergency meeting also shows that, no one knows who is wrong and who is right. And taking up the position as the United Nations, instead of calling the two heads of states to go to the headquarters where there was an emergency meeting to discuss the neutral point, they chose to side up one country, which is unfortunately, and we can see how the history of the United Nations has portrayed in terms of dealing with conflicts in the world. In fact, one nation that the United Nations has been captured. You can see that from the contribution from major countries such as the United States of America. And there's no doubt that in my mind, I can see that there's much influence from United Nations, from the United States towards the United Nations. And you can see the speech by the Secretary General of the United Nations that it is a biased speech, in terms of intimidating the sovereignty of other countries, which suits them rather than others which does not suit them.
Dr. Sinkala, always good talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for giving us some different thoughts on this equation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that's Dr. Charles Sinkala, who's an Africa Affairs political analyst, and giving us a view of the United Nations vote and the position that was taken by South Africa to abstain, and 8 other countries that didn't even vote in this resolution. All right, that's how we come to the end of tonight's edition of The Watchdog. Vuyo Mboko is back tomorrow, so for the rest of us, me and the rest of the team, have a lovely evening and stand by for The Globe coming up next.